Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum across the street. You see it here in our slide with our, we hope soon to be erected James Turrell entrance. But when when the evening here is over, we are inviting you across the street to a reception post-talk, but also a gallery viewing of our current exhibition that has, in a way, been a conjunction or a joiner between our programs that have long been planned around the Domino project and our current exhibition, The Vertical Urban Factory, of which I'll show you a slide actually here in just a moment. This evening's talk, and I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but I want first to give you a little bit of background if you don't have it already, if you're not familiar already, and to the Skyscraper Museum. I know we did a great deal of outreach last week in order to try to reach students of preservation and architecture, and I see a lot of fresh faces in the audience, so I hope that we were successful in bringing new audiences to the museum through this event. This program, though, is something that we've been thinking about, that I've been talking with Mike Lappin about for 3 or 4 years already. A project, Domino, new, old and new, that we're discussing tonight, which is going to bring together the history of the industrial waterfront of Brooklyn and its reinvention into a new residential neighborhood and a mixed-use neighborhood. And this project, which I've known about in a friendship with Mike over the years, is something that has been rather long in its evolution. And at the end of the presenters, Mike Lappin will talk about the mission of CPC for affordable housing, the difficulties of this particular deal, the challenges of the site. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the shape of the evening that you'll see in the program as well. We're really very fortunate tonight to have so many members of the team, but also such especially experienced architects, builders, preservation architect with Fred Bland and Beyer Blinder Bell, structural engineers Bob Silman, a general contractor, construction builder, and Frank Siami, who have had enormous experience in New York with major projects, and I'll introduce them with some of the specific, naming some of their specific projects. I'm just talking now because this is a little bit early for one of our programs, and as people do filter in, as I expect they will over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we'll have a little bit of the history out of the way before the presenters begin. At the end of the presentations, which we hope will be concise, we will have a moderated discussion. We'll bring the furniture back out into the middle, and Julie Oveen, who is the executive editor of the Architect's newspaper, will ask a few questions and moderate a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we hope to have plenty of time also for your questions from the audience. So let me go briefly through a little of the relevant history as it pertains to the Skyscraper Museum. This view that some of you may have seen in our postcard or on our website pairs the new Domino on top with the reinvention and the adaptive reuse of the central landmark structure, the filtering pan and finishing building, with a King's Views late 19th century view of the entire complex of the American sugar refinery factory. But this exhibition, the Vertical Urban Factory, that you can experience after the talk across the street, is one that is a little bit unusual for the Skyscraper Museum because the buildings that are included in a show that was brought to us by the guest curator Nina Rappaport are not really, they're high rises, but they're not skyscrapers. They're not taller than they are wide, but that they do fall within the mission of the Skyscraper Museum of being a building type which is exceedingly urban in its character, and that is the dimension of the show that unfolds in Nina's curation of the selected international historical examples as well as contemporary examples of reinvented factories and new factories. You can see the gallery and some of the installations with the conveyor belts that have been refurbished and serve as the center of the contemporary factory section. And on the back wall, the New York history, where the Skyscraper Museum staff spent a great deal of time last summer researching the history of New York as a manufacturing center, because of course through 1960 New York was the largest manufacturing city in America. It's a history that we have, many of us, I think many students today, have not been taught, so there was nothing to forget, but it's a history that we're not necessarily aware of, and that's one reason why the landscape of the industrial waterfront is so important to preserve. But at the same time, the reinvention of the city, not just of the waterfront, is the challenge that we face in the 21st century. The history of sugar in New York is absolutely bound with the history of the city. In fact, these first colonial sugar houses that were established in colonial times from the late 1600s and early 1700s were some of the tallest buildings in the city. At 5 or 6 stories or 7 stories, they soared above the domestic architecture of New York and even some of the institutional architecture of New York. You see here the Rhinelander 1763 sugar house, and obviously a masonry structure, in the process just before its demolition at Duane and Rose Street. And the history then of the particular complex that is our focus tonight can be seen in, this is the backside view of the Havemeyer and Elder sugar refinery that from the late 19th century, the 1880s, began to extend itself along the Williamsburg waterfront, as you see in this panorama from a perspective from King's Views of New York from 1898. Now, from the mid-1830s, while, as I said, New York sugar was one of the major industries of New York, these first vertical factories, which were erected, I didn't show you a Wall Street one, but actually occupied a space right next to City Hall on Wall Street. It's one of the subjects that we looked to in our last exhibition, The Rise of Wall Street. Let's see, in 1884, Havemeyer and Elder constructed the world's largest sugar refinery on the Brooklyn waterfront. The burgeoning industry consolidated in 1897 under the name American Sugar Refining Company, and at its peak, it controlled 98% of the country's sugar production. So New York was a center, an industrial center of sugar production, and this particular refinery was the largest refinery in the United States. You will hear about the filter pan and finishing house, the now New York City landmark structure, from Fred Bland in a moment. Let me just show you a couple more images of the way that it looked through the early 20th century, and then bring up a comparison that I think is enormously interesting and revealing. This is the Taikushing Sugar Factory in Hong Kong, a complex that was 53 acres in size, and you see it along the industrial waterfront of Hong Kong from the early 20th century. You see, I think, an extraordinarily beautiful refinery building that was part of the complex that was located at the port as was necessary for the transfer of goods and the shipping out afterwards. You see its reinvention from 1976 to 1987 into a housing site that is the largest residential estate in Hong Kong. As I said, it covers 53 acres. It's called Taikushing, and here you see it in its sort of evolving reinvention, housing 40,000 people, 12,700 units in 61 towers. 755 people per acre, which compares with Co-op City, which we think of as a high-rise, concentrated high-rise Newtown development, which is 163 people an acre. So along with the housing in 29-story units that have been built out over about 15 or so years, an enormously successful commercial speculative operation. on land that's reinvented for new uses, but in typical Hong Kong fashion, paired with mass transit, and of course seen against the mountainous landscape that is preserved as Country Park. So as a solution, this dense concentration in the vertical density of high-rises against the natural landscape is certainly something quite different than the situation that we have in New York. But this is a middle-class housing development rather than public housing. And as I said, it was the largest and enormously successful income generator for its commercial developers. So that brings us to this evening and the Vignoli rendering that we'll be examining that pairs the landmark restored structure with the housing towers that surround it. And Mike Lappin will in particular be filling out the particulars of the project. Well, let me just introduce very quickly our speakers, and I'll mention them all now, and then they'll come up one after the other. I forgot to do something, which is, I think, our next slide, which is for those of you who are architects who are interested in continuing education units, I'm obliged to show you these slides by the AIA, new rules. So you can read them later or really quickly here. Here's the course description and our learning objectives for this evening, and then you will be asked at the end if you have any questions, and we'll remember to ask you again if you have any questions. So that being done, let me introduce first Fred Bland, who is the managing partner of the architects Beyer Blinder Bell. I'm sure I don't have to fill any of you in on the background of that very august architectural firm that has a reputation for specializing in preservation projects, though they do all kinds of projects. Fred has been, I'm at the age where I feel your pain when I mention that it's nearly 40 years that Fred has been directing downtown development plans and led design of educational, cultural, and redevelopment facilities throughout the U.S. and also in China, relevant to our Hong Kong example. He is he's an active member of many civic boards, and I won't name all of those, but he's also an adjunct professor at NYU in the Fine Arts Department, and I think some of his students, and I know some of my employees or his former students are here tonight. He's one of the city's foremost preservation architects, and he has restored such prominent landmarks in New York as Grand Central Terminal, Rockefeller Center, and Ellis Island. That's enough to say about Fred. Then let me mention that then the structure of the evening is that the structural engineer, Bob Silman, will speak next, show some slides, and then his companion for this section, who is Frank Siami, will talk about the construction challenges that are posed by the landmark structure. So Bob also has been a long time in the profession. He's worked on more than 14,000 architectural projects and alterations, renovations, and new construction, and I want to mention some of his amazing landmark projects, which are Carnegie Hall, Falling Water, the Washington Square Arch, the Jefferson and the Jefferson Memorial, and the Museum of Immigration at Ellis Island. Frank Siami has done pretty much all of those projects also. He's well known as being the guy to call when you have a particularly high concept architectural design to realize or a particularly challenging cultural facility, as in the extension of Carnegie Hall and, well, to name some of his other projects, the new Museum for Contemporary Art, the Pierpont Morgan Library and Museum, the Guggenheim Museum Restoration, the Mark Hotel, and the new academic building at Cooper Union. And lastly, then, Mike Lappin will come and give us the background, the mission of the Community Preservation Corporation. Mike has been a friend for many years of my husband Mark and I. He's devoted his lifetime and career to affordable housing. And I'll read to you a little bit about CPC. Under Mike's leadership since 1980, the CPC has fortified communities across the country with financial support and guidance. Also, the President and Chief Executive Officer of CPC Resources that's developing Domino, Mike has led critical housing developments in New York as well as in New Jersey, including upstate New York. Since its inception in 1974, CPC has created and preserved almost 100,000 units of housing in both states. And I think that's enough to say generally for the bona fides of Mike and his dedication to housing and affordable housing issues. And then I guess, Julie, when we move furniture around, I'll introduce you as we get ready to go. Okay?